Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He just published a book. Title of the book is Mystery at the Blue Sea Cottage, a true story of murder in San Diego's jazz age. And his name is James Stewart. And this is a really interesting true crime, historical, nonfiction narrative book. I really enjoyed reading it as somebody who loves San Diego. It was really a good time and place of understanding kind of San Diego. And this is James's first book, so he can talk more about that. So James Stewart, welcome to the show. Thanks for agreeing to the interview.
Great. Glad to be here, William.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard your name or this book, can you talk kind of about your background and what led you to write Mystery at the Blue Sea Cottage?
It's a long story, of course, but I'll keep it short. As far as my background, I always wanted to be a writer. It was always what I thought I was best at, and I always wanted to write books specifically, but I got sidetracked from that for a long time. I ended up going into the Navy as a Navy officer and spent 25 years on active duty. And then when I retired, I started turning my attention back to writing. I always knew I'd get back to it. It just took me longer than it does some people. And so I went back to school here at National University in San Diego and got another degree, and this one was in English. And then I followed that up with a MFA in creative writing at the UC Riverside, or actually Palm Desert, low residency writing program. And I needed a topic. I needed a thesis topic, of course, for a master's degree. And I was pursuing the nonfiction track. They also have fiction, poetry, screenwriting. But I specifically wanted to write a narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction kind of novel, or not novel, but book. And so I started looking around. I wanted to write about a crime that took place sometime a long time ago. I've always enjoyed books like, say, Devil in the White City is a good example. Midnight in Peking. I could give you a whole bunch of other titles, but they're historical true crimes. And they're specifically narrative nonfiction, meaning that it's not just like a typical nonfiction book. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You tell a story, you try to tell it in scenes to the extent possible while sticking closely to the facts. So I was looking around for a suitable story, and I wanted it to be here locally in San Diego, or at least Southern California, because I knew writing about a case that was 100 or more years old would require a lot of research. And so I wanted it to be close to home. And so I started looking for something like that. And I just started asking around at the historical societies and libraries and people I knew and whatnot. And several people mentioned the Fritzy Man story. And what had happened was it became fairly well known around town. This was in about 2011. A local historian and writer named Richard Crawford had published a short piece in the San Diego Union Tribune newspaper about this case. It was a few pages long, but it piqued a lot of people's interest in the story. And when I was asking around about it, everybody had heard this story. And so I started looking into it. One of the things that really piqued my interest was at the San Diego History Center. When I asked, the young woman who worked there said, "Oh, you mean San Diego's Black Dahlia case?" Wow. That's how she referred to it. And it kind of had that feeling of an old San Diego case, a mystery, unsolved, that a lot of people were interested in. And so I started looking into it. She pointed me in the right direction. I started looking into it. And I found out that it was very famous in its day. 1923, January, when she went missing. And it had all the right elements I was looking for. I could do the research because it was a local story. I managed to find the trial transcripts. This case went to trial, which is kind of another criteria for this kind of story, because that provides a lot of information for putting the story together, which you don't have in some, very otherwise interesting cases. And then also, it was widely covered in the newspapers from day one in San Diego, but also the major papers in LA hyped the case. And it had all the right elements for that. She was young, very beautiful, a dancer, what they called interpretive dancing, which was kind of a big thing there. And she was known around town for her dancing and had been in a lot of different venues. And she was found on Torrey Pines Beach, at the time a very lonely beach. The circumstances of her death were very mysterious. So it was the kind of story I was looking for. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, if people are on YouTube, you can see a picture of the victim right here on the cover of your book as well. And she's in her kind of dance regalia, very kind of a flapper age. You mentioned a lot of the clothes of that era too. So she was kind of part of that jazz age, right?
That's exactly right. She was a young woman of her times. You could look at it that way. I wouldn't go so far as to call her a flapper, but she was certainly independent-minded. She was pursuing this career on her own. And so, and she dressed the part. She was, the clothes she was wearing when she left was kind of a flapper's outfit. It was a fancy party dress kind of thing. So, yeah. So anyway, that was why I picked this story, and I became fascinated by it because, as far as for a narrative nonfiction kind of book, it had not only was it an interesting unsolved mystery, but it was also very much about the place and time. Southern California, San Diego, and LA, because a lot of the investigation took place in Los Angeles area. And, it had all the right elements. There was the yellow journalism of the time where sensation mattered a lot more than fact. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
So that was really big then. So they tended to hype these cases. And that was actually a big part of this story, because when those cases got hyped, the facts of the case got distorted, and what she was all about got distorted. And, it's an old story, but it was really big there in the early 1920s.
Right. And you mentioned William Randolph Hearst, part of the book, who was coming through San Diego, but he was probably one of the biggest purveyors of that, or the beneficiaries really of that type of journalism.
Yes.
Can you kind of go back through? I mean, who was this? Who was it Man? What was her first name? Mitzi Man?
Fritzie.
Yeah, Fritzie.
Yeah. She came from an immigrant Jewish family. They had immigrated when she was 7 years old from Bosnia. Sarajevo, Bosnia was where they came from. And she was 7, and she had a sister that was 2 years older named Helen, and she had a brother named Williams who was 4 years older. So the children were all still young. And then her mother, Amelia, and her father, Isor, Isor, they immigrated here in 1910, came over on a ship, just like, the immigrants from Europe did in those days. And they stayed briefly with some relatives in Nashville, Tennessee, but they went on almost immediately from there to Denver, Colorado. And it took me a while to figure this out, but they didn't pick that place out of a hat. They didn't have relatives there, but it was kind of known as the World's Sanitarium, or Sanatorium, whichever you prefer. Her father, Isor, was suffering from tuberculosis. And that didn't come out when he came over here, but he was afflicted with it. And at the time, tuberculosis was a huge scourge. I mean, it was what everybody feared at the time, communicable disease, and a lot of people came down with tuberculosis. So that's why they went there. And there was also specifically two sanitariums for Jewish consumptives, as they called them. They call the disease consumption back then because it kind of consumed the person's body as they wasted away over a period of years. Terrible disease. And so that's why they went there. You got the high mountain air, it's dry. It was advertised as that. But he ended up dying 10 years later in 1920 from tuberculosis finally. And his wife, Amelia, decided to move to San Diego. And the reason was once again tuberculosis. Her older daughter, Helen, who at the time was about 20 years old, 21 years old, also had contracted tuberculosis. And, Denver didn't cure her husband, so she hoped San Diego might cure her daughter. So that was why they ended up going there. San Diego had going for it. It's a desert on the ocean. Had the fresh ocean breeze all the time. It was right on the desert, so it was dry and beautiful weather most of the time. So that was why they came here in the first place.
Right, and I think you said at the time when they were there, there's only 80,000 people in San Diego.
Yeah, roughly, as best I could tell, based on the records I could find. There might have been, say, 115, 120,000 in the whole county, which was a huge county and is a huge county. So yeah, it was San Diego at the time was, relatively speaking, a backwater. It was a small city, and it had, the tourism trade was starting to, heat up then in the teens and 20s, but it still had a long way to go, and it began growing rapidly from this time on. But at the time, it was, to give you an idea, Los Angeles was about 10 times the size population-wise of San Diego. So, LA was already a big city and obviously growing very fast. San Diego started growing fast, but it had a long way. And of course, it never caught up. But it's now the 8th largest city in the country by population. So, obviously it grew a lot. But back then it was relatively provincial. And Fritzy had trained as a dancer in Denver under a former ballet star who had danced with Anna Pavlova's group around the world as a ballerina. Pavlova being probably the most famous, ballet dancer in history. And her mentor, her name was Domina Marini, who is now completely forgotten. But for a while there, she was relatively well known. And she had settled in Denver, and then Fritzy and her sister Helen both trained under Marini. And it was not only ballet dancing, but it was also interpretive dancing, which was really becoming hugely popular by this time. Most people have heard of Isadora Duncan. She was an interpretive dancer. And then there was another famous woman, Ruth St. Denis, or St. Denis, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but she was very famous during the time Fritzy was training and dancing interpretive dance. So it was a really big deal. And so
it was kind of like avant-garde. So she was really kind of on the new edge of dance, right? Would you
absolutely
agree with that?
It's a precursor of modern dance. A lot of the modern dancers, when you hear that term thrown around, mostly in the 20s and beyond, we're doing interpretive dance amongst other types of dances. But so it was a precursor to modern dance, if you want to look at it that way. They tended to wear exotic costumes. They did a lot of Middle Eastern and Asian, or back then as they called it, Oriental. And it was relatively skimpy outfits. If you see the one there on the book cover, that's pretty risque for the times. And that was typical of interpretive dance. So in some, for conservatives, traditionalists, obviously they didn't like this very much. And so it had a pejorative term. They called it Oriental dancing or exotic dancing. And there was nothing overtly, sexual about it. Or burlesque. It actually, I see that somebody made a comment there. It might be somewhat similar to that, but they didn't do strip teases or anything like that. They just did these traditional ethnic kind of legends and that sort of thing from the Middle East and Asia mostly.
And it was interesting. Sorry to interrupt, but at that time it was interesting because that was very fashionable, right? Valentino, and I think there was the movie The Sheik or whatever. So that was kind of very kind of edgy, cultural, was to have those kind of Middle Eastern themed stuff.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. The Sheik, which came out in 1921, Valentino's, that's the one that really propelled him into superstardom. It was a hugely popular movie put out by the largest studio, Famous Players, Lasky. And that actually comes into Fritzy's story later on. But Hollywood had a huge influence on popular culture, way more than it does now. I mean, you just think it has a lot of influence now. Back then, it was, like half the population went to the movies every week. And that increased to like 75 or 80% by the end of the decade. So old Hollywood was big. Silent Hollywood was big.
That's all they had, right? That was their only choice.
Well, exactly. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have anything. They have radio was just getting around in the early 20s. So, that's what they had. They could go to the movies or they could go to live dances like what Fritzy did. And sometimes they even combined the two. And so anyway, go ahead.
So she was kind of like a dancer for events or what stag parties you said one. So not as a stripper, but as kind of an edgy avant-garde dancer, right?
Yeah, it ran the gamut. I mean, the first thing she was in was like in January of 22. A few months after she got there, she was in probably one of the biggest things that she ever did. It was at one of the largest theaters in town called the Colonial at the time. It was long ago torn down, but it was one of those things, huge old theaters. It was being converted to a movie palace at the time. And she took part in a week-long program and she danced the finale. So obviously she had a reputation. She had brought a letter of introduction from Denver with her, presumably from her mentor. And that helped her get involved in this show. And that was a big deal at the time. But it ran the gamut. She did much smaller venues a lot of the time, like at a country club, with 300 or 400 people, maybe. She even did like a chief petty officer's stag party, as they called it in the paper. And that sounds like it could be, salacious entertainment, but it wasn't. It was a lot more innocent than that. Yeah, sedate than that. But, of course, obviously, she was a good looking woman and in great shape from the dancing. And so, men liked looking at her and she was very popular. So,
and that figures into the story, right? Because once she is found, there's a lot of possible people. She was mixing around and moving to LA too, right? So she was moving up to, or working in LA, I should say.
Yeah, late in the year of 1922, she had been dating a couple of different men, one of them seriously, and then the other one after she broke up with him for a while there. And then in November of 22, she went to LA ostensibly to work. And apparently she did do some performances there. She stayed there for almost 2 months, right up until 1 week before her death. She was in the LA area, and it became one of the central mysteries early in the investigation about what was she doing up there. And so anyway, in January, it was actually January the 14th, 1923, her mother had noticed that she was acting strange, out of character, being very secretive. She said she was going to what she termed a house party in Del Mar, which is a resort right up north of San Diego here. But she wouldn't be specific about it. She said a man from LA was picking her up, but she wouldn't give his name or anything about him. And she'd never done that before. So it alarmed her mother. She knew something, Fritzy was up to something, but she didn't know what. So she kept telling her mother, not worry, I'll be home by the next day or I'll call. And so she left home in the evening of the 14th, which was a Sunday night. And then the next day, around noon, a family was on a little trip to San Diego, and they stopped by Torrey Pines Beach for a picnic, just to have lunch. And a little boy, 9 years old, went, running out onto the beach when they first got there and found her body and came back up, told his father. And then from there, the cops were called and started doing an investigation. She was dressed, like just in stockings and, pumps and a teddy. And that was all she was wearing. And her dress was relatively nearby, or what they took to be her dress. And it did, in fact, turn out to be her dress, was nearby in the sand. And when they first looked at the scene, they were pretty flabbergasted. They couldn't tell what had happened. You assume in San Diego, when somebody is washed up on a beach, presumably drowned, that it's an accidental drowning, because that happens very often here, obviously. So, but it started looking a lot more suspicious than that. And they found up the beach about 500 yards away, they found a handbag and a vanity case that Fritzy had left home with. So it looked like somebody had tossed him out of a moving car. So that was suspicious. And she didn't get to that beach on her own. So at least one other person knew what had happened to her. But they figured it was either a suicide or it was homicide. But they kept going back and forth.
Right. And at that time, Del Mar was actually not very well populated, right?
That's correct. It was pretty a lonely beach, especially on a Sunday evening in January. Even in San Diego, it was chilly that night. And the water was ice cold. So that was one reason why they kind of ruled it out. Yeah, I see somebody mentioned there, her shoes were on, which is also suspicious, right? Because if you've been tumbling around in the surf there for overnight or for hours, many hours, your shoes probably wouldn't be on, especially if you waited out there. Her teddy was relatively undisturbed, and the stockings and whatnot. So that was another thing that led them to think that something's wrong about the scene. It looked kind of staged. Some people even said that her arms were crossed over her chest, kind of like a Sleeping Beauty kind of pose. It was an unusual pose to find a drowning victim. So these were all suspicious things. Later on that day, I'm sorry.
No, please continue. Yeah,
she was taken to a funeral parlor. The coroner delivered her body there. That's what they did then. The coroner did not have his own facilities, and so any autopsies that needed to be done were done in funeral parlors. So when his autopsy surgeon got there, this was like 6 in the evening that Monday. The funeral director, or as they called him then, the undertaker, had already drained most of the blood from her body in the process of embalming her body. Apparently, he didn't get the word that an autopsy was required. So obviously that creates a problem. But during the autopsy, he determined two major things, the autopsy surgeon. One is that she did in fact drown, and two, that she was about 4 months pregnant, 4 to 4.5 months pregnant, which immediately caused this story to really take off, because that's a big scandal then. 20-year-old single woman, huge scandal then. So they also found over her right eye, there was a bruise that could have been caused by, maybe somebody knocked her out and threw her in the water, something like that. So it was ultimately ruled a homicide. And that's how the cops investigated it. Although for weeks, and even for the rest of the case, pretty much, whether she committed suicide. She had been despondent. She was 4 months pregnant. The man who had gotten her pregnant had refused to marry her. So she was despondent. And so in a lot of women in those circumstances, seeing they really didn't have any choice, the man would refuse to marry him. What are they going to do? They're going to be ostracized, and her career would have been over for sure. And so she had reason to be despondent. But there were all these other things that looked very suspicious. And whoever got her pregnant also had a motive. It was also much more common then, reason for homicide back then, when a woman got pregnant and man didn't want to marry her, but then she threatens to, expose the scandal. So two men filled the role immediately of suspect. One of them was an actor she had dated briefly the previous fall, as it turns out, around the time she got pregnant. And he worked for a small company. His name was Rogers Clark. Big, tall, good-looking guy. He had just kind of started in the film industry, or was trying to get a foothold in it. But he was also known as a ladies' man. So he dated a lot of different women around this time. And then the other one was a doctor named Louis Jacobs. And Fritzie had been dating him for some months the previous year, up until the time almost when she started seeing Rogers Clark and possibly a few other men at one time or the other. But
her family thought when she turned up dead, her brother and mother were saying Rogers Clark, right?
Yeah, they didn't like him. Her mother specifically didn't like him. She thought that he was a playboy, and he was wealthy. He had a Marmon touring car, which had a lot of cachet then, and he would just show up to pick her up and honk his horn, kind of summon her to come out and join him, kind of thing. And this was new. Dating was a new thing there. Before that, if you wanted to date a young woman, a man had to call on her at home, where her parents were. But in the early 20s, with things loosening up, with prohibition, with partying and drinking in the jazz age and dancing and all that sort of thing, dating got started, because this was a point where a lot more people could afford cars. So that's how it happened. The man would come pick the woman up and take her out on a date. And so that was really brand new at the time.
Right.
So,
I think you said that, was it F. Scott Fitzgerald bought that same car after money for This Side of Paradise or something?
That's right. Yeah.
But you can just envision that too. And I think there's a picture of that car too in your book, right? So there's something suspicious about what was going on with that vehicle, because it had evidence of an accident, right?
That's correct. At the beginning, within the first 3 or 4 days of the investigation, both of these guys looked like they could equally be guilty. Neither one of them had a good alibi. As it turns out, they both had a motive, because they could have been the father, or a potential motive. And in the case of Rogers Clark, he didn't come, even though his name was in the papers, because her mother screamed his name at the funeral parlor. His name was all over the papers, but he didn't step forward and come see the cops. So that was suspicious to them. And finally, it wasn't until Thursday, 3 days after her death, 3 to 4 days after her death, that he was arrested by the LAPD, where he was staying in Los Angeles. And his car, this Marmon touring car, looked very suspicious. It looked like it had a collision, possibly. There was blood in the back seat. It looked like somebody had tried to clean it up. The gauges on the dashboard had been smashed. So this was very suspicious to the detectives. The chief of police in San Diego, a man named James Patrick, actually took the train up to interview Clark for the first time. And he was very suspicious about him for all these reasons. Plus, a couple of the people that Clark had tried to use as his alibi for the night of Fritzy's death. Admittedly, he was in San Diego that night, but a couple of the people that he used as his alibi refused to be his alibi and said, no, it's not true. Okay. And then Dr. Jacobs had been, he claimed that she had come to him on the Friday before her death. That was the last time he saw her, he said. And she told him that she was pregnant and that she was secretly married to an actor, and that she asked him to perform an abortion. He refused. This was illegal at the time. Abortion and even birth control was illegal. So this was his story. In fact, he actually had walked into Chief Patrick's office on his own initiative, saying, I know the dead girl. This was the day after her body was discovered. I know the dead girl. I want to help you clear up the mystery. I saw her on Friday night. She was despondent. She said that her husband had abused her and abandoned her. She was married to him secretly. She was also secretly pregnant. But he gave screwy answers, and he didn't give a good alibi either. He basically didn't have an alibi for the time in question. So early on, say up in the first week until Friday morning, both of these men were under equal suspicion pretty much. They both had all the things there that made them look guilty and or at the very least very suspicious.
Right. But they, just to sorry to interrupt, but they, either one of them could be the person who was with her at the Blue Sea Cottage, right? Can you explain that whole situation, how the detectives found out about that? And the
on Wednesday, a couple of days after they found her body, a patrol cop who was canvassing the places around the La Jolla and Del Mar area. She had said that she was going to Del Mar to a house party, just that vague idea. But right after she had left home, she called her mother and then said, actually, it's going to be in La Jolla, which was a little closer, a little farther south, closer to San Diego, but still, removed from San Diego at the time. And on the coast, resort town, tourist area. So he was canvassing, this cop was canvassing the resorts and the cottages. La Jolla was becoming known for these tourist cottages. And he was canvassing all these places to see if anyone had checked in there on the night of her death, because they were trying to put together a timeline. Where was she? They couldn't find that she had actually met anybody early on. So where was she? Where was this house party? Did she go to a house party? All of this was up in the air. So they were looking at places where a house party might have happened or where she might have gone with somebody. And they finally discovered a place called the Blue Sea Cottages on Wednesday. And this was a group of cottages that were used mostly for tourists. And this was in January, so they weren't all that many tourists, but there were some, because San Diego tends to be nice even in January. And but they found out that the police, when they started doing an investigation, found out that Fritzy had in fact shown up there on Sunday evening, a few hours after she had left home, and with a man. And they verified that it was Fritzy, and that they had stayed in this particular cottage number 33. And they found some of her articles in there. It looked like the bed had been used slightly. The tub had been used. And so there were some indications that that they had actually been there for some period of time. But according to the manager, they weren't there very long, just a few hours. And when he went out making his rounds late that evening, the car was gone and the place was dark and looked like they were gone. So he had checked in, and Fritzy had checked in, and he had signed the register as Mr. and Mrs. Johnston, LA, from Los Angeles. And so the search, it was a pseudonym, and the search was then on for the mysterious Mr. Johnson. From then on, that became, after they found out where she had been that evening, that became the next big thing. as far as the investigation goes. So who was he? Well, although the manager had identified Fritzy's body right away as the woman, he was very wishy-washy on the guy. The initial description he gave could have been Dr. Jacobs. He said that in the face, he looked kind of like Clark, but Clark was 6'3", so it couldn't have been him. He wasn't nearly that tall. He was like 5'9" or something. So, but he was wishy-washy, and he refused to say whether either one of them was the guy. Well, in the meantime, the police eliminated Clark as a suspect, the actor, and that left Dr. Jacobs. And then they started concentrating their search on the Los Angeles area where Fritzy had spent most of the previous 2 months. So what was she doing up there? That was the big thing. Who was Mr. Johnson, and what was she doing up in LA all that time? And did it have anything to do with her death? Because her mother said she was acting strangely from the time she returned from LA for the week until she died. So they started looking into that. And it turns out that she had stayed with a friend of hers in Long Beach, which is a suburb of LA, just south of LA, for about a week. And then she had moved on and was staying in a hotel, the Roslyn Hotel, downtown Los Angeles. And there were some indications that she had performed at one or two places down there during November, late November, early December of 1922. But then when her friend, her name was Bernice Edwards, came from Long Beach to visit Fritzy at the Roslyn Hotel, this was later on in December, she found Fritzy at this time about 3 months pregnant, or 3.5 months pregnant, sick and despondent. And basically she wasn't performing at this time. She was too sick to perform and was not in good shape. And so she decided finally to return to LA. Well, it comes out, to San Diego, because it turns out at Bernice Edwards' house after Fritzy's death, the police found amongst her effects she had left there a series of correspondence, letters, telegrams between her and Dr. Jacobs, the man who was the doctor at a VA hospital back in San Diego. And according to her friends, she was in love with Dr. Jacobs. And although they initially, Bernice Edwards claimed to not know that she was pregnant, she did, in fact, know. She was just trying to protect her friend's reputation. But, it came out at the autopsy anyway.
Right. I mean, and there's a lot more to this story. And there's pictures of Edwards in your book. She's dressed to the nines for that time. It's like very stamping that time and place and culture right there. I mean, we've only covered a third of the book, if that. I mean, there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more discoveries and things like that. I mean, what would you advise the listener? Like, the next steps, your book is available. How would you like to end this? Like, do you want to add anything, or is there anything I missed?
I would like to add that not only is this an unsolved mystery from a very fascinating period in our time, our history, but it's also a story about her and her family, how they came here for a better life. But there were a series of tragedies, starting with the father's death and Fritzy's death, and then her sister died shortly after that from tuberculosis. So it ended in a nightmare. So the story is also about that. And it's very much about the time and place, because all of the things that I cover in there is whether you're talking about the prohibition, corruption that was rampant at the time, the Hollywood influence, the fact that Fritzy had Hollywood connections, the yellow journalism, all of these things had a direct impact on the case. So I go into some of those things throughout the book. Which, it's part of the story to me, and it all of those things had a direct impact on it. So, when the case finally went to trial with the corruption and all of that, and the way it was covered. So it's a lot more than just an unsolved mystery. It's a narrative nonfiction book that covers other themes.
Right.
And
And your culture, you input the culture of that time, just like you said. Really fascinating. Where's the best place to get Mystery at the Blue Sea Cottage?
You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at Barnes and Noble. You can get it at a lot of local places, at least in San Diego, independent bookstores here through. I also have a link to Indie Bound, which is a service that is involved with indie bookstores if you prefer to go that route. I have a website. It's James Stewart Author, all one word, .com. And I have links to my social media as well as Amazon, Barnes and Noble, IndieBound.
And people can contact you there if they have any additional questions or anything like that, right?
Correct. There's a link there with my email.
Your email and everything. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for the interview. Really fascinating. Again, the title of the book is Mystery at the Blue Sea Cottage, a true story of murder in San Diego's Jazz Age, and the author is James Stewart. So, James, thank you so much.
Thank you, William. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Stay there. All right. That was perfect. So,